Welcome to Innovating Music, a podcast of the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. I'm your host, Dr. Gigi Johnson. Today, please enjoy this wonderful episode with us with Portia Sabin, the head of the Music Business Association. She has been able to help music biz step up to a completely online delivery, but in part because she is a triple threat, both a doctorate in anthropology, extensive time in rock bands as performers, but also extensive time in trade associations looking at the world through different lenses of connectivity. She's really looking at how people crave togetherness and how the powers of trade associations are even more important in this distributed and high change era. So enjoy this podcast. Thank you for joining us. And with not much forewarning on our side, we appreciate your joining the podcast.
No problem. I'm happy to be here.
So you have a fascinating multi-tiered life and then have stepped in to be coming in as a leadership role of the Music Business Association during this incredibly crazy time. So can we maybe start with the backup, which is how did you end up getting from being an artist and a label to going into the other sides of looking at change in the business?
Well, it's funny because, I recently articulated this in a different way. I feel like I'm a person who was crazy about music, who became a person who's crazy about the music business. I think I sort of fell in love with the business as I got to know it more and more. When I started out as an artist. I actually picked up the bass guitar at 14 and was unable to find anyone to play with, partially because that's just a tough age, partially because, the boys had already been playing in their bedrooms for years and were much better than I was. And I was afraid to ask, I was really afraid to go up and say, hey, can I play with you? Even though you're like, blah, 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 and I'm like, ding, ding, dunk, dunk.
But why the bass? How did a bass get in your hands?
John Taylor from Duran Duran played bass, and I thought it would be a better conversation starter than just, I think you're really hot.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, I had aspirations at, 12 and 13 to, be a standout from the crowd in that way. I was like, I gotta do something more interesting than just be another fan of music.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, in an apartment in Manhattan. And, I often think to myself, my true love is drums. I ended up becoming a drummer and playing drums for over 10 years in bands. But, that was never going to happen in a New York apartment. So I always think the bass was sort of my gateway drug, if you will.
Absolutely. So you ended up then playing the bass and playing in bands and playing the drums, and was college in the journey? It was. You were a college grad doing all sorts of interesting stuff.
Yeah. College is where I really it's where I found out that I wanted to play the drums. It's where I got into my first band. I took my journey to music was always very punk, in that I took one drum lesson and I instantly was like, there's no chance I'm ever going to do this if I just have to sit in a room and play paradiddles. So the very next day I got into a band. I had gained a lot of self-confidence, in the last several years. And I just asked a whole bunch of boys that I went to college with if they would be in a band with me. And so the very next day after one drum lesson, I was playing drums in a Pixies cover band, which you can imagine how fantastic that was.
Well, it was that era.
Yeah.
It was appropriate for the time.
Right. I couldn't hold a beat for more than 15 seconds or whatever. But, I look back and I think, those guys were the nicest guys. They just completely put up with me. But I really fell in love with it. And so I never stopped playing drums from that very first Pixies cover band. I ended up, going into multiple bands. And then my college band, when we graduated, we moved to Minneapolis to make it in the big city, because Minneapolis was one of the closest big cities to Grinnell, Iowa. So we went to Minneapolis and we got a practice space and we started playing gigs. And, that was my perfect life, right? I worked in a coffee shop and I lived in a house with 8 other people and I played drums in the basement and I played out at night. And it was, my ideal. So that was fun.
But then how did you end up then? So we're in May of 2020, and I have hordes of undergraduate students coming to me now going, do I go on to grad school? And I keep going, no, go do music. Don't go on to grad school. But you went on and got your doctorate.
Well, I did. But, for me, I just had this feeling I had to do something that my mother would be proud of. I had this weird feeling that if I just, because I moved back to New York. I was in Minneapolis for about 18 months after I graduated from college. And then I moved back to New York, and I moved into my old childhood home on 51st Street between 9th and 10th, and got a job as a temp because I discovered that my only marketable skills after 4 years of fabulous liberal arts education was my typing speed, because my mother had sent me to the Betty Owen School of Typing when I was 12. So I had that as a marketable skill. Not that I didn't love my liberal arts education. I did. I mean, gosh, that was like the best. Those were some of the best years of my life. I really loved it. But I didn't find myself graduating with a lot of skills that people wanted to pay for. So I got a job a temp job at an investment banking firm, making presentations in PowerPoint. So that's what I did in the day. And I, within literally 2 days of moving back to New York City, I had gotten into a band. I'd found a band looking for a drummer in the Village Voice, the old back pages of the Village Voice. This is before the internet, children. You don't even understand these words. But so, yeah, I answered an ad and I got into an all-female band. It was my first all-female band. I had never been in an all-girl band before. I'd only been in mixed bands or bands where I was the only woman. And we played in New York for 4 years. We had a great time. But during that time, I also enrolled in grad school because I kind of got the impression from my mother that if I was just going to be a punk rock drummer and a temp, that was not really going to fly with her. And, I had fallen in love with anthropology when I was at college. And someone had suggested that I look into the anthropology and education program that's housed at Teachers College at Columbia. And I loved it. I got in and I went and I loved it. I was 10 years younger than any of my classmates. I was completely full of myself. I screamed at someone on my very first day of grad school for using the word reify, which is hilarious now when I look back. Because I felt he was being pretentious, which he was.
It's grad school. It's grad school. It's grad school.
I now know.
It's multi-syllabic grad school. Yeah,
exactly. So that was my life for a really long time in the city. I went to grad school. I went to my job making presentations, and then I spent every night, either practicing, playing out, going to see friends' bands, up till 4 a.m, 5 nights a week. I just sort of lived that downtown rock and roll lifestyle. And I'm really glad I did, because I feel like the rest of my career really has benefited from the fact that I lived that life. So I understand what artists are going through. And I agree with you. I'm 100% on your side when you tell young people, just do it. I find myself telling students, every time I interact with students, there's a lot of people who say like, well, I'll form a band when I've done this, or when I've written the perfect song, or I'll start playing out when I feel like my hair is the right length or something. I feel like people have a zillion billion excuses for why they don't just go out and do it. And I've always been a huge proponent of, no, you just have to go out and do it, because the thing about playing music is it's not for everyone. It's really fun. It is definitely fun, and you get an endorphin rush and all of the above. But it's a hard decision to make as a job. And there's a lot of things about it that a lot of people don't like. I remember the first time we went on tour, and of course you lose money, you sleep on people's floors, you play to 6 people in a club. It's not glamorous right off the bat. And you have to be prepared for that, and you have to enjoy it. I think that's critical. So I did that. I played in bands for 10 years, and I got my Ph.D. And then when I left my band, my final band, which is the one that had a little bit of success, we had a song that got played on the radio and got written up in Interview magazine by Greil Marcus, and we, toured the country a couple times and made a couple records. We sort of did the indie band thing. When I left that band, I wanted to take the knowledge that I had gotten and help other bands with it. So I instantly started an artist management company called Shotclock Management. And I started managing the band in the New York scene that I had been friends with that I thought had the most potential. And they instantly broke up so that's how you learn.
That's another part of the business of music, right? It's like
Exactly.
the chances that your band will last forever are nearly zero unless maybe you're the Rolling Stones. But the end of it is part of to plan for. But let me back up half a step. So you came into this kind of as a triple threat, that you had seen the business side of the business in some major and boring ways yes, PowerPoint did exist back then. And then you got a doctorate, but looking at kind of the human side of humanity, which actually I think is a great prep for music business, and had been an artist. So did you get to a point where you're thinking, I should go teach, or I should go be a business person in a bigger organization, or this was just the obvious direction to go and have your own management company?
Well, the management, I had sort of weirdly compartmentalized my life at that point, and I had the music side and the academic side. So when I graduated, I actually got a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington. And so I started my management company and also started this postdoc at the same time, because in my mind, they were still kind of separate. And then I had this experience that brought everything together, which was I started to manage a band. I was managing a band. I had managed this band for a couple of years. And one of the things I had done in my younger days was live in England for a little bit. I went on my semester abroad to England, and I had spent some time in England sort of on my own. And I really thought that this band was exactly the kind of band that England would love. So I started taking this band that I was managing to England, and they ended up going gold in England. They were a band called The Gossip. And so I was thrown into this crazy situation where I lived in Olympia, Washington. I had my day job in Seattle, Washington, which is like an hour and a half drive away. And then I had to fly to England like once a month to take care of this band and do stuff with this band. So my life became like a total melee for about a year. And right about when everything was just crazy, my husband, who had started the indie label Kill Rock Stars in 1991, just came to me one day and he said, hey, listen, I think I'm sick of doing this. I don't want to run this label anymore. I want to explore different options in the music business. I'm going to apply for this job at a major label. Would you take over the label and shut it down? And really, I mean, I think when he said shut it down, he meant like just sort of run it as a catalog label, like not really sign any new artists or do anything, not really be active, but just sort of manage the label. And so that was the moment that I had the soul search, and I had to say, what am I doing? These two things, academia and music, are not really melding for me. I have to figure out what I want to do for real. And so I agreed. I quit my postdoc. I took over Kill Rock Stars. The band went gold. We went through that whole, I signed them to a major label. I signed them to a major publishing deal. Everything sort of crazy started happening on the business end. And then, so it just thrust me in to the business side really right away, and that's when I started to discover how much, I had always been interested in the business side. There's always one person in a band who's kind of the business person who handles the business stuff. Hopefully, exactly, if you're lucky. And I was always that person for my bands. And so, to me, that was part of the interesting part of this was like, just how does this work? What are the processes? Like, what is publishing? Why do we have to care about it? And so, that's when I really got, immersed in the whole business side of it. At the same time, one of the things, a lot of things that happen in life is serendipity. And, I think students listening to this need to hear that and take it on board, because it's really true. It's like, you can plan for anything you want, but life is still going to throw a lot of curves at you that you didn't see coming. And so one of those things is that my husband had been one of the founding members of a trade association for the independent labels called A2IM. And the year that they were starting that, and in fact, I went to the inaugural meeting, which was in a bar in Seattle. And so since he had left Kill Rock Stars, I stepped into his shoes on the board of A2IM, like the second year the organization was around. And I ended up being on that board for 12 years, off and on. I would take, because there's a mandatory year off, so you take a year off, and then I get voted on the board again. And honestly, I really feel like that experience is what teed me up a lot for my current music business job, because I discovered how much I like trade associations. And I ended up being a board member of the RIAA for a couple of years, for the Recording Academy, the Pacific Northwest chapter. I was the chair of the board of Music Portland. I helped start Music Portland in Portland, Oregon, and served as chair of that board for a few years, until I moved away last fall. And I served as chair of the board of Rock and Roll Camp for Girls in Portland for about 5 years. So I just really discovered that boards are fascinating to me, and that they are a place where a lot of things can get done in the industry, in a way that I hadn't been visible to me before. So I think that's probably one of the big reasons that I ended up getting this job. It a lot to do with how the people that I knew from having been on all these boards, and then just my interest in the kinds of change that that trade associations can achieve.
Excellent. So you have most people with their journey stories, they're like chunky iterations of single directions that shift gears, and you've been doing almost a simultaneous buffet all this time. And it sounds like that's one thing that brought you well into the same thing of a buffet of organizations together as trade associations. I tend to think of trade associations oftentimes, and I don't want to malign anyone, as people with different interests attempting to be under the same roof and find common ground. What has been, without naming names of anything negative, the differences in the way these organizations run, specifically with the lens of we are now not in person, we are now attempting to represent our interests? What have you kind of seen in the way that trade associations live, and how they live, and how that thrives or is challenged right now?
Well, I think, I'm sure you've heard this from a lot of people that you've spoken to, but certainly, the biggest takeaway from this pandemic has been that, people crave togetherness. They really want community. Community is not just a nice word that we say; it's like a real thing for people. And with my anthropology training, I'm not surprised by that, but it's very true. And so, I find that people have been even more eager to get together and talk about issues than they were beforehand. It's easy to be so distracted in our everyday lives, running around, traveling, and taking this meeting and that meeting. I think people are prioritizing pulling together right now. And I think trade associations are kind of a great place for that to happen, because, really the bottom line is the welfare of the membership, right? Of everybody doing better than they are. And so that's, I think, fostered a lot of great discussions in trade associations about, how can we help each other? How can we help our members? How can we help our community? So I actually think it's been positive.
What we've been seeing a lot of is new associations and new trade organizations when there were gaps. So whether it's the independent venues, whether it is in the UK, whole new nightlife associations, it's almost like if there wasn't one, now is almost the ultimate need for one.
Absolutely. I love it that NEVA has sprung up here in the U.S. The venues have long been, for whatever reason, sort of non-joiners. And it's funny, I remember, because I was around at the beginning of A2IM, I remember having these conversations with other independent labels. And it's like, independent labels, if nothing else, are really, really independent, right? And that's what people would say, is they'd just be like, well, I'm just not a joiner. Like, I don't join things. I'm an independent label. Like, I'm over here in, some part of the country. I'm doing things my way. And that's what I want to do. And I think, I think it's been fascinating and really cool to watch the growth of A2IM. Now they have over like 400 label members, and it's every label that you have ever heard of, is now, every indie label is now really a member. They're very few. I mean, I can't even really think of any big well-known indies or even small niche cool indies that aren't part of A2IM. And it's because everybody started to see the value of working together, and that, you can do more together than you can alone. You may be a lone voice and you may be an iconoclast and someone who stands on their own 2 feet or whatever. But the bottom line is you have more bargaining power when you're together. You have more clout, with the rest of the industry when you're part of a group. And so I'm thrilled to see NEVA spring up. And I think, venues have traditionally sort of had that like outsider mentality, individual mentality. And I think now is a perfect time. That shows, not only how venues need each other and venues need to be part of the conversation that we're having in the industry, but also how we need venues. Look at everybody in the music industry. All of our artists are grounded, right? Nobody can play out. So this really points up how we are a community all together. And it's not just, I think I've said in many interviews and on my podcast multiple times that in the last 2 months that, if this pandemic had happened 20 years ago, we never would have seen the kind of togetherness and outpouring of support that we have in the industry right now, because people were really segmented. 20 years ago, I have my little piece of pie and I'm over here in the corner and I'm not sharing. It was I think it was extremely different. And I think we've seen so much work to, come together. And I think it largely has to do with the digital revolution and the fact that, the entire industry tanked and, our main form of revenue, which was physical sales, tanked. And then we all had to learn how to get with the new program. And, the work that folks have done at trade associations like, Mitch Glazier at RIAA and David Israelite to pull together the MMA, Bart Herbison, these people who have done incredible work on behalf of everybody, to set things up with the MMA for something that's going to help everybody in the industry grow. So I do believe that sort of set the tone. And now we're living, the last 2 years, we've been living in this lucky situation where people get it, that they need to work together and that we're stronger together.
At the same time, you also have had similar growth of organizations locally. You'd mentioned Music Portland, and they were able to, because of their existence, be able to be surveying Portland venues within a week of everything starting to come together. So you've also had other groups who come up locally that have been able to build parts and pieces to also support local economies.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, I want to see more of that. And I kind of have a vision for music biz. As this trade association, I'd like to be the local trade association's trade association. I'd like us to be the sort of parent organization for all these small local trade associations. I think we can really work together. But it means we need to find ways to support the creation of trade associations in cities that don't have them, but they do have music business. And it's funny because, people talk about, there's no industry in that city. And when people say there's no music industry in a city, they tend to mean there's no major label presence. But that means that there's only, industry in a few cities in America, which is crazy because we know that there's music business happening all over the place and there's great companies all over the place. And so, I feel like we need to encourage the creation of these local trade organizations to centralize. Music Portland is an amazing example of how if you build it, then it exists and then people utilize it. Which is like duh, but it's really true in practice. We had a situation at Music Portland where, after the organization was created and after we'd been around for like a year and, put out lots of information so that people knew we existed, we got approached by a developer who was talking about creating a centralized music hub for all sorts of, stuff to happen. And I'm like, that person, if we didn't exist, that person wouldn't have had anyone to call. You know what I mean? And they had like millions of dollars. Like they were like, hey, we've got this project and we need your help with it. And I was like, wow, like they would have just had that millions of dollars would have just gone begging because there would have been nobody to call.
Yeah. And so many of those organizations have pulled together into things like REVS, the Reopen Every Venue Safely group between about, I think it's like 9 different cities, and then all of the work that nightlife.org is doing. So it's interesting that there's so much now sort of building groups of groups, which I think that's a great combined mission with Music Business Association.
Absolutely.
Sort of hit 2 more beats here on this. One is it's been fascinating for those of people who follow the podcast, that there were a group of us who did an Amplify Music virtual conference back in April with about 30 organizations, and coming up fairly quickly to put something out there for people to talk. And I could probably be at 5 conferences a day right now, as so many organizations who did major live events have had to regroup to think about how do we convene in a distributed sense. And Music Biz is a long-time strong event that used to be in Los Angeles. They moved to Nashville, lovely kind of tentpole of major events in May usually. And you guys have had to rethink, well, what the heck is our gathering now? What have been the processes of thinking through for this community in this time, how to restructure the gathering of Music Biz? Needed to pivot, to move what's been a robust live convening every year as the core and the heartbeat of the organization online. So Music Biz has been doing that. What was the thought process in how you would pivot, and then what the community needs in this somewhat actually getting busier digital convening space online?
Totally. Well, the first thing we wanted to do was bring resources, information about resources to everybody. So our first Music Biz Live 6 weeks ago was with Facebook and Instagram to talk about the things that they were doing for the community and the tools that they had available, and ways that people could connect using those platforms. And they the thing that was sort of shocking us is we started out doing 2 a week, and to see the number of people who were engaged and who would come to these Music Biz Lives, it really made us astonished, because, it just proved that people are really seeking information and they're seeking connection at this time. Like it was actually really way beyond our expectations in terms of the numbers of people who were turning out and the engagement. People were using the chat function in Zoom to network and to connect and to, talk to each other and ask questions and, just be active. And it was really heartwarming, to see how heartwarming and sad, right? Because, we can't be together. So this is how we have to interact. But at the same time, there was so much engagement. And, we ended up after 6 weeks and 14 Music Biz Lives with like 4,700 people from 47 countries coming to these events. And so we ended up realizing that this is, at this time, this is a service that we really can provide to our membership and to the industry writ large, because people need the connection, they need the place to gather, and they need to feel like this is normal. We need to talk about the stuff that's going on in our industry and our world together. We can't just be stranded and separated from each other forever. So I actually feel like it's been shockingly positive.
So Music Biz has been doing webinars and other things for a while. Is this maybe a opportunity to mean, I tend to think of large conferences that we have phenomenal connection once a year and then little pieces of things in the other 364 days. Is this potentially a robust avenue for music biz and other conferences to build all that interstitial space in between out to be community builders? Or there's a need. What is then the overall opportunity to kind of build something longer term?
Well, I think we will see. We have a big plan. I mean, we have about 20 weeks of programming right now slated for the rest of this year. And we're going to do a bunch of things. We're going to pilot a bunch of programs next. We're going to do. I almost said next week, but that is not. That's not very evergreen. We have a ton of programming coming up for this year, and we're piloting a whole bunch of technologies to see what we can offer to people, because long term. I mean, first of all, I think this crisis is going to last a little bit longer than we all wish it would. So we're probably going to have to do this for longer than we think we will. But then also, it is an option, an opportunity to build some practices and some events that people enjoy and that are useful to people that we could take into the future, even when we can get back together. I heard someone say not that long ago that, I think it was when we were talking to the people in Europe, the Global Trade Association folks in Europe, that probably what's going to happen for the next couple of years is we're going to have to be open and shut and open and shut and open and shut as we get this virus under control. And that means that all of these tools we're building now are actually really going to be useful in the long run, because, it's like, let's say we can get together and have a conference and we do that, but then we all have to shut down again. Well, we've got these tools already built and people have already, tested them out and enjoyed them and found them useful. So, it's nothing but positive in that way.
Well, also you mentioned, I think, 47 countries coming together, which hasn't necessarily been the robustness for music biz in the past. So it becomes what time zone are we in question more than
right.
Where do we show up and when do we come to Nashville to convene? So
Exactly.
There's a lot of really interesting new threads connecting that weren't robustly there before.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, 4,700 unique viewers, we're not going to get that many people in any meeting room at the JW Marriott, in Nashville. So it is a weird opportunity in that way.
And as well, there'll be continuing needs for change and challenge for the various members and potential members who now can be part of that. How do we live through this on a robust and growing basis? I want to twist backwards to one other thing, which is that you've had this fabulous future of what podcasts now for quite a few years. How did that prep you for the current challenges, and what are you seeing as its opportunities going forward, and how does that sort of intertwine with all the different things you're doing?
Well, I think nothing can prepare you for living your life on Zoom. So I feel like that's a very different experience from, when I went into the Music Biz Live series, I was like, oh, great, interviews. I've been doing those for 6 years. This is totally my wheelhouse. And then as soon as the camera came on, I was like,
It's like being face-to-face 5 inches away from somebody's eyeballs the whole time. I was like,
know.
Oh my gosh. And I'm being looked at every moment. And yeah.
Oh, it's kind of awful. So the Zoom portion I've been a little unhappy with, but I keep trying to say to myself, it's still the same quality of interview. Like still give them the same quality of interview with, even though I'm thinking in my head, oh my God, everybody's looking at like my nose is uneven or something.
I've noticed a gap in my tooth that I really didn't see before. It's like, exactly. Oh crap. I will see the dentist when we can go back.
Yeah. So yeah, that didn't really prepare me for a lot, but I think the podcast has been great. We've been doing it since 2014, in that it's just such a great way to get people talking about issues, and really to that's another thing I really love about the music industry is that when you counsel your students to go talk to people or network or like meet people, I think people are really intimidated by that a lot of the time. They think, oh, I can't talk to this person who's the CEO of this company or the executive vice president or something. But the truth is the music industry is really friendly. People care about their jobs. They care about what we do. They care about helping artists and helping people's careers. And so for the most part, almost everybody is really willing to talk about what they do and their job and why they love their job. And that part, I think, is why it's what helped me fall in love with the music industry, the music business as an ecosystem, because everybody really loves what they do. And I feel like you don't necessarily get that in every industry. I think there's a lot of people who go to a job just because it's a job, not because, this makes them filled with joy. And so many people in the music industry really love what they do. And I also always really wanted to highlight the fact that there are so many people behind the scenes working on the business end. It's not, seeing an artist on tour is kind of like the finished product, or listening to an album. But it's not, but there's so much that goes into that, that I wanted to sort of help to highlight that with the podcast. And I still think it's true. I think it's fascinating. I do think we have a little bit of a problem with the general public in that I think we're kind of like the movie industry or the TV industry in that I don't know that people really want to see how the sausage is made. I think they don't necessarily want to know what goes on behind the scenes. But every now and then, and I'm sure you find this all the time, when you have kids who are actually interested in the business aspect, they're fascinated, and they really want to find out, well, who did this and who's the, how did publicists work and, what does it mean to create a marketing campaign for a new album and, stuff like that. So there's a lot to it.
It's hard to see beyond the bright shiny at times or to realize that the bright shiny is only a few people as well. And so that there's that sort of the idealized business, but there's all the other people, which has been one of my joys in going to music biz is seeing so many different people from different dimensions. Well, we're nearly at the end already. This has been a great conversation. Let me ask my final question of not having a crystal ball, but what do you look forward to as to what we all could possibly do in the next 6 months? Are there things that you see afoot that are going to be interesting, new opportunities, new organizations? We talked about NEVA, where people may want to get involved?
Yeah, I feel like I made a list of silver linings at one point because every time I would have a conversation with somebody, it would reveal a new silver lining to this ridiculous and horrible situation that we're all currently in. And there's just so many things that might come out of this. The strengthening of community is a big one, right? If the venues get involved, and come into the fold and, sort of play with everybody else in the same pool, that would be a huge gain for everybody. I feel like there's opportunities to discuss topics that have, previously been taboo or previously been things that people just are too busy to talk about, that could help the industry. There are changes to government regulations. There are changes to tax laws that might have long-term impacts on artists and people in the music community. When I was talking to those folks in Europe, they were talking about tax cuts, like certain types of tax cuts. And, the fact that the music industry in the U.S. made a huge push to Congress to think about how artists get their income. So they're not W-2 workers, and they're not always just 1099 workers. They're sometimes a combination. They're sometimes a totally different, their taxes are more complicated. So it's not easy to give them a loan by just saying, submit your W-2s and then you can apply for a loan. Any kind of changes that we might end up making to the laws and regulations that will have long-term effects that could benefit people in the industry would be amazing. So, I just feel like there's a lot of opportunity right now, and for us to come together. And that's the great part, right? Is that we don't really have anything else to do except come together right now. So it's just, it's rife with possibility and opportunity. And I'm hoping that we come out of this stronger and better and more committed to, the strength of our industry as a whole, rather than, I always say, like, let's grow the pie so we can all benefit, as opposed to, I'm going to take my piece of the pie and run away and hide.
And now we can see the pie a little better at times, which is good too.
Absolutely.
So we're at the end of our adventure here. Anything you'd like to mention we didn't talk about?
I don't think so.
And if people would like to reach out to you, what's the best way of getting a hold of you?
Portia@musicbiz.org.
And what would you like people to reach out about?
I love to connect with people. I'm always interested in hearing who's out there and what they're interested in. Certainly I'm happy to talk to students who want to talk about, options and opportunities. New businesses, new tech startups. We have a lot of tech startups as members at Music Biz, and I think that's been a great pivot for us. Because there are so many people who are coming into the music space who are doing great things and solving real problems that we have in the industry, way better than it used to be. I feel like some years ago, the tech people who came into the music space were not actually interested in music business problems. They were interested in finding a new market for their tech. And I love it that there's so many people who are actually solving real problems, finding new ways to monetize music for artists. I always talk about a company called TrackLib that is, letting people sample in a way that clears, the licenses are cleared easily. And as a result, older artists that perhaps people have forgotten about are having new life because they're being sampled by young artists and their music is being brought back into the public eye. So, just so many ways that tech has been beneficial to the music industry. And I love it that we're all playing nice now, music and tech.
Yeah, or at least understanding each other's languages, which is always good as well.
Right.
And helping bring it all together right now. So a lot of things happening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.